Hey guys, Mr. Wheeler here. This section is on the future of biodiversity. And so the future of biodiversity involves saving species. And there are a variety of different methods for doing this. The first method that we're going to look at is captive breeding. What captive breeding is it involves breeding species in captivity with the hope of reintroducing populations to their natural habitat. One example of a captive breeding well, I guess I call it a minor success, is the California condor. And so California condor was critically endangered, and it was down to 9 surviving individuals. But those individuals were they were brought into captivity, and they were bred, and the population was able to we were able to bring the population back to 210 individuals. So going from 9 to 210, that is great for the population of California condors. However, the problem, and why I was hesitant to label this as a success, is because the problem with captive breeding is that while we breed organisms in captivity, their survival as a species is still doubtful, because it's very difficult to reintroduce these organisms back to their natural habitat. Because after a couple of generations of being in captivity, they no longer have the survival skills necessary to survive in their native range. Another way that we seek to save species is by saving the germplasm of the species. And so germplasm is any form of genetic material such as that contained within the reproductive germ cells of animals and plants. And so this material can be stored as seeds, sperm, eggs, or even pure DNA. I'll show you a video, I'll post a video on seed banks and how different countries will actually send their seeds to these seed banks to be stored underground indefinitely, just in case there's some catastrophic event and where there's loss of biodiversity. These seed banks can then reestablish those populations using those seeds. Another way to save species is through the implementation of zoos, aquariums, parks, and gardens. The original purpose of zoos was to display exotic organisms, but today they seek to preserve species. And so the problem with saving species in these areas is that captive individuals often do not reproduce or survive again in the wild, very similarly to how I said with captive breeding. Also, small populations are extremely vulnerable to infectious diseases and genetic disorders due to having low genetic diversity as a result of inbreeding. And so what inbreeding can do is inbreeding can concentrate recessive genetic disorders. And so this is a pedigree that shows, to read a pedigree, you have, whenever you're tracing a certain trait, that trait is indicated by shading each individual. And so individuals 12, 13, and 24 in this case, these are individuals that they are carriers for a certain trait, but they don't exhibit the trait. And what we see is when inbreeding occurs between individuals 13 and 24, half of their progeny, half of their offspring actually end up with this trait. And so if this was a bad genetic disorder or any negative trait, that's very bad for that population. And so that's what inbreeding can do, is it can concentrate those bad traits over time, over many generations. Another conservation strategy is to promote sustainable land uses. And so this is a picture of a coffee plantation, and this coffee plantation, it's right up against the rainforest. And for a long period of time, there was a lot of plantations in Costa Rica and Colombia, and what they do is they would cut down the rainforest so that they could have these plantations to grow their coffee. But now, a newer thing for these plantations to do is to grow their coffee trees right in the canopy of the rainforest, thus preserving that area and thus being able to preserve species. And so this is an example of sustainable land use. While all these different strategies can help preserve species, the most effective way to save species is to simply protect their habitats. This can be done through establishing marine sanctuaries, marine protected areas, national parks, state parks, national wilderness areas, national forests. All of these are examples of ways we can protect large habitats. And so rather than trying to protect the individual species within the habitat, if we can protect the entire habitat, then we could protect the species that are within the habitats, as well as all of the ecological relationships are going to be preserved as well. And so some species require large ranges to find food, find a suitable mate, and to rear their young. So the only way we can save certain species, especially some of those predatory species, is by preserving their habitat. Another thing is conservation prioritizes protecting the entire ecosystem rather than just the entire species, because the population is more valuable than just an individual. While we could save just a few individuals and say, hey, we're saving the species, that doesn't really mean much if we can't save the population. And so we need to preserve and restore native habitats. We need to link them to larger networks. We need to promote products that have been harvested or produced with sustainable practices, like just like the shade-grown coffee that I already mentioned. Some countries, especially the United States is good at this, offer legal protection for protecting species as well. So the United States is actually among the strongest countries in the world for protecting our native species. And it's a good thing since the United States does cover a lot of land. The main way that we do this is through the Endangered Species Act, the ESA. And so the Endangered Species Act is designed to protect plant and animal species and ones that are in danger of extinction. As of 2012, there's almost 1,400 species of plants and animals that were listed as endangered or threatened. And so the provisions of the Endangered Species Act are right here in this table. And so the first one is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they have to compile a list of these species so they kind of can database what species need protected. And then the ESA makes it so that it's illegal to catch, kill, uproot, trade any of these species. And it makes it so that the government can't carry out projects that jeopardizes endangered species. And then the last part of the Endangered Species Act is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for preparing species and habitat recovery plans that will allow for these species to rebound and come back as a population. And so those are measures that we've taken in the United States through the Endangered Species Act. But on an international level, we have the IUCN, which is the International Union for Conservation of Nature. What the IUCN does is it facilitates efforts to protect species on a global level. So it very similarly to how the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service maintains a list of the threatened and endangered species in the United States, the IUCN maintains the list, the red list, on a global level. And so what the IUCN is it's a collaboration of almost 200 government agencies, over 700 private conservation organizations, and it publishes this red list on it updates it regularly. And so it actually has multiple levels of endangerment. So you could have endangered, threatened, least concern. There's more levels than just the two, endangered and threatened. Another way that species are saved globally are through treaties, and the most popular or well-known treaty is the CITES treaty, the CITES, and this is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. The CITES treaty was originally implemented as an effort to stop the slaughter of African elephants, which were being and still are being killed for their ivory tusks. When this treaty was implemented, poaching declined dramatically after the implementation, but poaching is still a problem. And these pictures I think I pulled, I want to say it was 2013 or 2014. No, that's not right. Maybe 2016. I don't know. But they're relatively recent. And this is the government of Kenya. They seized all of these elephant tusks, and they're burning the ivory to take the ivory off the market. And so even today, elephants are poached to a very large extent. What poachers will do is they'll band together in large groups so that they can't get arrested, because if you have a large group of poachers, like 30 or 40 strong, and they all just get on horses or in jeeps, and then they ride with their machine guns, and then they surround a group of elephants and shoot them all, that's what happens. And the government really doesn't have any way of combating that, because they don't have that many people in poaching enforcement, and so they get away with it. And so unfortunately, even with these treaties in place, poaching is extremely hard to stop. Some other things, we have the Earth Summit. This is the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. This is more than 100 world leaders and 30,000 other participants. This was in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The goal was to tackle environmental issues on a global scale. There's the Biodiversity Treaty. This is a treaty with the goal of preserving biodiversity and ensuring the sustainable and fair use of genetic resources in all countries. The United States always takes a long time to adopt these global treaties because we are a democracy and we have to vote on them. And a lot of groups of people don't always agree on these treaties because there's a conflict of interest. And so some political groups, they reject the treaty to the suggestion that economic and trade agreements should consider any impacts on biodiversity because those agreements could be economically bad for them. And so it's very hard to get treaties ratified or passed in the United States. It's hard to get the United States to sign on. In addition to efforts in the United States through the Endangered Species Act and global efforts, there are private conservation efforts worldwide as well. Some of the most prominent private conservation efforts are the World Wildlife Fund, Nature Conservancy, and Conservation International. So the World Wildlife Fund, what they do is they encourage the sustainable use of resources and they support wildlife protection. The Nature Conservancy, what they do is they purchase millions of hectares of habitat preserves in many countries, and so what they do is they'll take donations and they'll buy very large swaths of land to protect the habitat. And then this third one here is Conservation International, and what they do is they help to identify the biodiversity hotspots, as mentioned previously, and they develop ecosystem conservation projects in partnership with other organizations and local people. And so Conservation International, World Wildlife Fund, Nature Conservancy, these are just three of many private conservation efforts that seek to preserve biodiversity. And so that's it for this section, and I hope you learned something cool.